How does an empire that once besieged Vienna end up with foreign accountants collecting its taxes? What transforms a sultanate into a debtor state where bondholders in Paris decide which roads get built in Anatolia? And why did the collapse of the Ottoman Empire begin not on a battlefield, but in a bank vault in London? The year is 1881. In a grand building overlooking the Bosphorus in Istanbul, a ceremony takes place that receives little attention in the Western press. Representatives from Britain, France, Germany, Austria, and Italy gather to sign documents establishing the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. No troops are deployed. No territory changes hands. Yet this moment marks one of history's most complete conquests, achieved entirely through ledgers and interest rates. The Ottoman Empire wasn't destroyed by armies. It was purchased on installment. To understand this financial strangulation, we must go back to 1853. The Ottoman Empire at mid-century still controlled vast territories, stretching from the Balkans through Anatolia to the Arabian Peninsula and across North Africa. Sultan Abdülmecid ruled from the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, commanding millions of subjects. But beneath the impressive geography lay a troubling reality. The empire was economically medieval in an industrializing world. If you're watching from anywhere around the world, I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. Hit subscribe and drop a comment below. While Britain and France built railways and factories, Ottoman agriculture remained stuck in feudal patterns. Tax collection was chaotic, depending on provincial governors who often pocketed most of what they gathered. The treasury constantly ran short. For centuries, sultans had solved cash problems by debasing currency or confiscating wealth from wealthy officials, but these medieval solutions no longer worked in the modern era. Then came the crisis that changed everything. In 1853, Russia invaded Ottoman territory, triggering the Crimean War. Britain and France, fearful of Russian expansion toward the Mediterranean, allied with the Ottomans. They sent fleets to the Black Sea and armies to Crimea, but they also sent something more consequential: bankers. The war consumed resources at a rate the Ottoman treasury couldn't sustain. Soldiers needed pay, artillery needed casting, ships needed provisioning. Sultan Abdülmecid faced an impossible situation. His advisors presented a solution that violated centuries of cultural and religious resistance to usury: borrow from European banks. In 1854, the Ottoman Empire issued its first foreign bond. A syndicate of British and French banks underwrote the loan. The terms revealed the asymmetry of power. The bonds were issued at 80% of face value, meaning for every £100 of debt the Sultan signed for, he received only £80 in actual cash. The banks kept £20 as commission and risk premium. Yet the empire had to pay interest on the full £100. The effective interest rate was punishing, but the immediate cash felt like salvation. The army received wages. The war continued. Eventually, with British and French help, Russia was pushed back. The Treaty of Paris in 1856 ended the conflict, but the borrowing didn't stop. Sultan Abdülmecid and his successor, Abdulaziz, discovered something intoxicating. With signatures on paper in London, gold could appear in Istanbul almost magically. They looked at Paris and London with their gaslighting, their opera houses, their grand boulevards, and felt a burning desire to prove Ottoman civilization could match European splendor. The spending that followed had little to do with productive investment. In 1856, Abdülmecid ordered construction of the Dolmabahce Palace on the Bosphorus shore. The old Topkapi Palace, home of sultans for 4 centuries, seemed too oriental, too old-fashioned. The new palace would rival Versailles. Dolmabahce consumed resources on a staggering scale. 14 tons of gold leaf covered its surfaces. The main chandelier, a gift from Queen Victoria, weighed 4.5 tons of crystal. Baccarat crystal staircases, silk carpets. Italian marble walls. The palace cost 5 million Ottoman gold liras, approximately 1/4 of annual imperial tax revenue. It was built entirely with borrowed money. To finance this and other prestige projects, the empire returned to European lenders repeatedly. Bonds were issued in 1855, 1858, 1860, 1862, 1863, 1865. Each time, banks in London and Paris were eager participants. The commissions were lucrative, the interest rates were high, and bankers operated under an assumption of moral hazard. Britain and France would never allow the strategically vital Ottoman Empire to collapse, so the loans were ultimately backed by great power politics. By the mid-1860s, Ottoman finances had entered a death spiral. Tax revenue couldn't cover interest on existing loans, so new loans financed old interest payments, the classic structure of a Ponzi scheme. Debt service consumed an increasing share of the budget, 15% in 1860, over 50% by 1870. Consider what that means. Half of every tax collected from a merchant in Damascus or a farmer in Macedonia immediately left the country to pay coupons to bondholders in Europe. Nothing remained for armies, schools, infrastructure, or administration. The state was hollowing out. When European credit markets tightened temporarily, the government turned to local financiers in Istanbul's Galata district, mostly Greek and Armenian bankers who charged short-term rates of 18 to 20%. These weren't development loans. They were desperate bridge financing to avoid immediate collapse. Sultan Abdulaziz, who took the throne in 1861, added military vanity to the spending. He ordered ironclad warships from British yards, purchased Krupp artillery from Germany, and briefly assembled the world's third largest navy on paper. But the empire couldn't afford to fuel or maintain these ships. They sat rusting in the Golden Horn, floating monuments to borrowed grandeur. The system required continuous economic expansion and available credit. In 1873, both disappeared. A financial panic originating in Vienna spread globally, triggering what historians call the Long Depression. European banks, facing their own liquidity crises, stopped lending. Simultaneously, catastrophic drought struck Anatolia in 1873 and 1874. Crops failed, livestock died, famine spread, the peasant tax base evaporated. Tax collectors sent to villages found skeletal populations with nothing to give. Revenue collapsed, but debt obligations remained fixed in gold. By summer 1875, Grand Vizier Mahmud Nedim Pasha examined the ledgers and recognized the inevitable. The treasury was empty. A major payment to European bondholders was due in October. There was no money. On October 6, 1875, the government issued what became known as the Muharrem Decree. It announced that debt payments would be cut in half, 50% paid in cash, 50% in new paper, promising 5% returns. In diplomatic language, this was a debt restructuring. In financial terms, it was default. Reaction in Europe was furious. Hundreds of thousands of middle-class investors in Britain and France had purchased Ottoman bonds for their high yields. Clergymen in England, shopkeepers in Paris, their savings evaporated. European newspapers denounced the Turks as thieves. The diplomatic support Britain and France had provided against Russia vanished. Financial weakness invited predation. In 1877, Russia declared war. The Russo-Turkish War was a catastrophe. The Ottoman army fought without pay, undersupplied and demoralized. Russian forces reached the outskirts of Istanbul before the Treaty of San Stefano halted them in 1878. The Ottomans lost vast Balkan and Caucasian territories. Worse, Russia imposed a war indemnity of over 800 million francs. The empire now owed hundreds of millions to European banks, already in default, plus massive new war reparations to Russia. Total obligations exceeded the entire value of the Ottoman economy. Sultan Abdulhamid II, who had taken the throne during this crisis, presided over what appeared to be a corpse waiting for dismemberment. But European powers had a more sophisticated idea than territorial annexation. Direct colonial administration was expensive, requiring armies and bureaucracies. Financial control was cleaner. If they could capture the empire's revenue streams, they could extract wealth indefinitely without governing populations. In 1881, representatives of European bondholders arrived in Istanbul. They carried briefcases, not weapons. They negotiated not for land, but for cash flow. The result was the Muharrem Decree of December 1881, establishing the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, the OPDA. This institution was unique in imperial history. The OPDA was a corporation controlled by a board representing British, French, German, Italian, and Austrian creditors. Its headquarters in Istanbul became a fortress-like symbol of who truly controlled Ottoman finances. The decree transferred the empire's most valuable revenue sources directly to this foreign entity. The Sultan could no longer be trusted to collect his own taxes, so the OPDA would do it. Taxes on tobacco, salt, silk, alcohol, stamps, and fishing rights all passed to European control. The OPDA built an efficient bureaucracy, employing over 5,000 collectors. These men, wearing uniforms and carrying authority, fanned across the empire, from Macedonian villages to Syrian ports. They answered not to the Sultan, but to the board of directors. If a fisherman caught fish in the Bosphorus, a portion went to London bondholders. If a farmer harvested silk near Bursa, profit went to Parisian banks. If a peasant bought salt, the tax went to Berlin. There is a common misconception that the OPDA was simply corrupt extraction, but it actually operated with impressive efficiency. Unlike the chaotic Ottoman bureaucracy, it employed modern accounting standards. It improved salt mines, distributed disease-resistant silkworm eggs to farmers, and invested in productivity, but for creditor benefit, not citizen welfare. Between 1881 and 1914, the OPDA collected approximately one-third of total Ottoman revenue. One of every 3 coins generated by the economy was siphoned abroad for debt service. The Ottoman government operated a vast empire, maintained courts and armies with only 2/3 of its own tax base. This created permanent poverty. The state couldn't invest in education or infrastructure. It couldn't build industries. Capital surplus that might have funded development was extracted by the debt mechanism. The Sultan reigned, but the OPDA ruled. If Abdulhamid wanted to build a school or road, he needed permission from bankers who usually said the money wasn't available. But the debt trap extracted more than money. It extracted sovereignty and became a tool for manipulating Ottoman foreign policy. This opened opportunities for a new player, Germany. While Britain and France were content extracting payments, Kaiser Wilhelm II saw a strategic advantage. He visited Istanbul, embraced the Sultan, and portrayed the British and French as parasites. Germany, he claimed, wanted genuine partnership. The Germans proposed the Berlin-Baghdad Railway, a steel line connecting Europe to Middle Eastern oil fields, bypassing the British-controlled Suez Canal. The Germans offered to finance it. Deutsche Bank became the primary lender, but contracts were predatory. They included kilometric guarantees. The Ottoman government had to pay guaranteed profits per mile of track regardless of usage. Crucially, contracts granted Germans rights to all oil and minerals within 20 kilometers of the railway. The Sultan had traded British financial chains for German steel ones. By 1910, the empire was effectively a German economic satellite. German officers trained the army. German engineers ran infrastructure. German banks held new debt. Britain and France watched their influence slip away, seeing Germany gain a foothold in the strategic Middle East. The debt had become a cause of great power friction pushing Europe toward world war. By 1914, Ottoman leadership, now dominated by the Young Turk movement, recognized they were trapped. As long as debt existed and the OPDA controlled finances, they weren't free. When war erupted, the Ottomans made a fatal gamble. They joined Germany, believing that if Germany won, they could cancel debts to Britain and France, abolish the OPDA, and regain financial independence. On declaring war, one of their first acts was expelling British and French directors from the OPDA headquarters and stopping payments to London and Paris. For a moment, they tasted freedom. The gamble failed catastrophically. The empire was destroyed in World War I, but the debt survived. When Mustafa Kemal Ataturk founded the Turkish Republic in 1923 after a brutal independence war, European powers returned with ledgers. At the Treaty of Lausanne, Britain and France demanded the new Turkey pay the dead empire's debts, arguing Turkey was the successor state and inherited the obligations along with the territory. Ataturk fought hard but recognized Turkey needed integration into the global economy. He couldn't begin a new nation as a defaulter. He agreed to restructured payments. The new Turkish Republic, devastated and poor, spent its first 3 decades sending millions abroad to pay for Sultan's reckless spending from the 1850s. The final payment on Ottoman debt was made on May 25, 1954, exactly 1 century after the first bond was issued in 1854. This returns to our opening questions. The Ottoman Empire's collapse demonstrates that, in the modern era, conquest doesn't require armies. Financial dependency is more effective than military occupation. The British and French didn't need to garrison Istanbul. They waited for compound interest to do the work. They proved that the most efficient way to dismantle an empire is lending it money it can never repay. The Ottomans thought they could import modernity by purchasing European splendor with borrowed capital. They didn't understand that every loan is a tether, every bond a constraint on sovereignty. They confused the appearance of great power status with its substance. The sick man of Europe didn't die of natural causes. He was foreclosed upon. The lesson inscribed in Ottoman ledgers echoes across history. Sovereignty isn't just about borders and flags. Sovereignty requires solvency. A nation that cannot control its own revenue streams cannot control its own destiny, regardless of how large its territory or ancient its throne. If this perspective on how empires fall gave you something to think about, I'd appreciate it if you subscribed. Financial forces often shape history as decisively as battles and revolutions. They're just quieter and take longer to kill.